So in the second of two lessons today, we're going to be talking about thermoregulation. And so the term itself gives you an idea about what it is we're going to be discussing. So thermo meaning heat. And so thermoregulation really just describes how we are able to maintain or regulate our body temperatures within a certain range so that our enzymes can function properly and that other metabolic processes can occur efficiently. And so this process, as you can imagine, varies widely amongst animal species, but there are some generalities that we can make. For example, we can break down organisms into two different main groups, ectotherms and endotherms. And so in common language, we often refer to these as cold-blooded versus warm-blooded organisms. So ectotherms, those are organisms that depend on the air temperature to help regulate the metabolic rates. And so if the temperature drops drastically, so do their metabolic rates. It's what allows some organisms to do really well in cold temperatures as they hibernate. For example, we see the lizard here, and the lizard is able to maintain its constant internal environment by just simply some behavioral adaptations. It's going to go onto a rock, and that rock is going to conduct some heat onto it if it's getting too cold outside. Radiant energy from the sun is going to help to heat it up. If it overheats, then it will start breathing faster, and that evaporation will cool it. Maybe there's some convection off of its body, some convection currents that will cool it. But overall, these behavioral adaptations are what allow it to regulate its own internal environment and its metabolism. Okay, so these include lots of invertebrates, fish, amphibians, and reptiles. Of course, we're not going to go through the gamut, but you get the idea. Of course, all of this is within a certain reasonable ranges as well, but endotherms, that's what we are. Endo, think inside, internal. They're able to maintain a constant body temperature regardless of the surroundings. And again, if we look at this graph here, we can see that the snake's body temperature is going to increase or decrease drastically depending on the outside or ambient temperature within reason. Whereas the endotherm, and the example here given is the bobcat, but we're very similar. We can see that 37 degrees Celsius roundabout being maintained irrespective of the temperature outside. And that's because of several mechanisms that we have that allow for that temperature regulation. And so how do we do this? How do we maintain a constant internal environment despite changes in the air temperature? Well, the way that endotherms do that is by simply increasing the rate of cellular respiration. So we know in that process there's an increase in disorder, an increase in entropy. And through the process of cellular respiration, it's not 100% efficient, and we end up losing some energy as heat. And that helps to maintain our body temperature. Mammals and birds exhibit this type of thermoregulation. Mostly, depending on the organism, we're looking at about 37 degrees Celsius, and in humans we know that to be true. And so, well, what's regulating that in us? For us, we have sensors in our brain. A part of our brain called the hypothalamus is going to be responsible for regulating this process. So I didn't want to complicate this by giving you a big diagram of the brain. But we'll be looking more closely at different components and structures in the brain. The hypothalamus, you'll see just above sort of this teardrop structure down here. This is the pituitary gland, and the hypothalamus is just a little bit above that. And you'll see that it's involved in a lot of coordination, but specifically in this case, it's what's responding to changes in our air temperature. So I don't want to go over this note specifically. I'm going to look at a diagram to help explain a little bit of this, but if you want to pause the video at this point and write down this to incorporate into your notes, here it is. But I'm going to move on to a diagram because I think that'll be a more interesting way to explain thermoregulation in endotherms. So, of course, just as ectotherms are going to have behavioral responses that will adjust their body temperature, like sunny on rocks or breathing faster, and so on and so forth, we have certain internal mechanisms that take care of that, that are automatic. And so this is a big diagram. What I'm going to do is I'm going to zoom in on this upper portion where we're talking about what happens when our temperature goes above our set point of 37 degrees Celsius, and then we'll look at the second half of this in a bit. And so if you were in class today, I would be asking you some details about this. Oopsie, there's the bell. If you were in class today, we would be talking about some details around this, but how do you know when you're getting cold? How do you know? And so most people will say that they start to shiver. And how do you know when you're hot? Most people will say that they start to feel sort of sweaty, maybe even faint, right? So let's take the road of our body temperature starting to get a little bit above, a little bit higher than our set point of 37 degrees. Well, we have these things called thermoreceptors that are in our skin and our body that will detect whether our body temperature is getting sort of a little bit above its set point. And so that's the sensor part of our negative feedback mechanism. So in this case, what's coordinating all of this, what is our integrator in the system, is the hypothalamus that we've already discussed. And it's going to turn on a couple of different cooling systems. And so one of these effectors is our blood vessels. So our blood vessels are going to dilate or get sort of wider and bigger. And what that's going to do is it's going to make our blood able to flow a little faster. And it's going to cause our warm blood to be able to get close to the surface of our skin. And that close proximity to our skin is what's going to allow some of our body heat to just simply leave our body. And that's what's going to cool us down. Now another thing is those blood vessels will expand and move closer to the surface of the skin as opposed to away from our core. So the result of that is that as the heat leaves through our skin, that our body temperature is going to decrease, okay, and that's going to send a signal to our body to stop dilating our blood vessels. Now, another thing that can happen is that as our hypothalamus is signaling the opening up of a cooling mechanism, we're going to start to sweat, right? And so you can imagine that as our sweat glands are going to begin to release sweat, that evaporation, the moving of heat from our body to that water to produce it, to cause it to evaporate, that's going to release a lot of heat out into the environment and thus sort of suck it out of our body. And that's going to be another way that we are able to cool ourselves. So of course, when that change in temperature is detected, we're back at our set point, then that's going to signal to the sensors are going to indicate that and signal that to our integrator, the hypothalamus, to cool us right down, to stop the sweating. Now, what happens when we get a little bit colder, when our temperature reaches below the set point? Well, same thing. We're going to have thermoreceptors in our body that are going to signal to our brain, okay, the hypothalamus, our coordinating system, that we need to make some changes that are going to create an increase in body temperature. And so let's look at the blood vessels first over here. So our blood vessels instead are going to constrict. That means they're going to get narrower. And that means they're also going to move towards the core of our body and around our vital organs. And that's because, that's an evolutionary process that wants to protect our vital organs from being damaged. So we want to maintain their temperature more than we want to maybe maintain some other components, some peripheral parts of our body, like our limbs, for instance. Right? Because we can lose a finger, we can lose a toe, but we can't survive with our brain or our heart or our lungs being damaged from cold temperatures. That's why hypothermia, usually you feel it's your fingers or your toes that end up having to be amputated if you get frostbite too badly. So the result of that is that you're conserving energy close to your core. and that will start to result in less heat being lost by your body. That's one thing that can happen. Now, another thing that will happen is you'll start to shiver, and really what that is your skeletal muscles are starting to contract, and that shivering, sort of like just friction in general, is going to release heat. It's also going to use up energy, right? So your muscles moving, requires energy, and so that's going to initiate the breakdown of glucose with oxygen to produce energy. In that process, you're going to produce heat, right? Just that shivering itself is creating heat because of cellular respiration. Now, another thing that is sort of there from evolution, and it's not as big of a deal now, but most people will say that when they get really cold, their hair starts to stand on end. And so let me see if I can get a picture of that kind of going here, just sort of representative. So imagine here's your skin, and then you have hairs, and they're normally sort of like that, right? But then you all of a sudden get cold, and your hair stands on end. You get like a little bitty goosebumps that are elevated, and then your hair starts to stand on end. And what that is aiming to do, although how effective it is another issue, what that does, or is meant to do, is to produce sort of an insulative layer, right, between the air up over here and then your skin, because air is actually a pretty good insulator. And so as a result of that, it's supposed to help prevent that cooler air from affecting your core body temperature. And we see that in other objects where air is actually used as an insulator, like in building like quinzhees or igloos. Those, they can trap air particles within them, and that produces a little bit of insulation. Some coats are manufactured that way. That all comes from, the hair standing on end, results in sort of a layer of air that is supposed to act as a bit of an insulator from the cooler air outside. Okay, so if we're looking at a response to heat stress, the major ideas I want you to glean from this are that your sweat glands are going to begin sweating to cool you off. Your blood vessels in the skin are going to dilate. That's going to increase blood flow. In response to cold weather or cold air, cold stress, then what's going to happen is an opposite response with respect to our blood vessels. Our blood vessels are going to constrict, and that's going to keep blood flow close to our vital organs and reduce heat loss through our skin. Our hair is going to go stand on end and trapping some still air, act as an insulator. And also the contractions of our skeletal muscles is going to initiate some shivering. That's going to use up some energy and generate heat through cellular respiration, and also just through friction in general. So there's our overview of thermal regulation. Make sure to keep any questions that you have for class tomorrow, and we'll be happy to discuss them to clarify any difficult points for you in this lesson. See you tomorrow, hopefully.